The year was 1895, and the high desert of New Mexico still carried the breath of old frontiers, a land where dust rose from horse hooves and fortunes changed as fast as the wind. 18-year-old Elena Montrose watched that same wind sweep across the fields of her family's once grand estate and felt its cold truth. The Montroses were nearly ruined. Her father, Colonel James Montrose, had been a man of reputation, a Civil War veteran who built his pride upon land and lineage. But the mines had failed. The railroad had bypassed their county, and the debts now piled higher than the family silver. In the dimming parlor, amid fading portraits and cracked marble floors, the colonel made a desperate choice: to marry his daughter to wealth. The name Chayton Greyhawk arrived in their household like a whisper, first through the banker, then through the neighbors. He was an Apache ranch owner, educated back east, rumored to have bought out the very men who once refused him. Some called him proud, others said ruthless, but what everyone agreed upon was his prosperity. His land stretched for miles, his horses were the fastest in 3 counties, and his word carried weight with men who'd never looked an Apache in the eye before. For Elena, the proposal was both unthinkable and unavoidable. She had been raised to believe marriage was sacred, a union built on affection and faith, not survival. Yet every night she saw the worry carved deeper into her father's face and heard her mother's soft weeping through the walls. When her father told her, "It is the only way to save what remains of us," she didn't argue. She simply lowered her gaze and said, "Yes, Father." The wedding was planned within a month. As the sun fell over the valley on the appointed day, Elena sat before her mirror in a white lace gown that once belonged to her grandmother. The dress was beautiful, but it felt heavy on her shoulders, as though it carried not fabric but fate. Her hands trembled while the maid pinned a sprig of wild sage, her groom's request, into her dark hair. "He says it brings strength," the maid murmured. Elena didn't know whether to find comfort or fear in that. Outside, wagons rattled and guests gathered, drawn more by curiosity than celebration. Some whispered openly, "An Apache marrying into white gentry?" Others watched silently, wondering whether this union was a sign of progress or desperation. Elena heard their voices drift through the open window, and each word felt like another thread pulling her away from the world she once knew. Then she saw him. Chayton Greyhawk arrived on horseback, dressed not in the black suit her father had suggested, but in a tailored jacket with silver embroidery and a turquoise stone at his throat. His long hair was tied neatly, his posture calm, his eyes dark and unreadable. He dismounted with effortless grace, greeted the colonel with a firm handshake, and bowed slightly to Elena's mother. When his gaze finally met Elena's through the window, something unexpected passed between them. Not passion, not yet, but a quiet understanding. She looked away first. The ceremony took place beneath an arch of mesquite branches. The priest's voice trembled over the wind as he joined their hands. Elena's palm was cold, her pulse a small bird in her wrist. Chayton's hand was warm and steady, grounding her like the earth itself. When he spoke his vows, his voice carried the rhythm of the land, measured, honest, unadorned. She could not tell whether he loved her or simply respected the promise he made. But when he said, "I will honor you," she believed him. After the guests departed, and the laughter faded into the distance, the great house fell silent. The night air grew heavy with the scent of rain. Elena stood before her new husband in the lamplight, feeling the weight of every choice that had led her here. She wanted to speak, to ask what he expected of her, of this marriage, but her throat would not open. Instead, she whispered, "Do you think we can make this work?" Chayton's answer came gently, without hesitation. "We will not make it work, Elena. We will live it day by day. That is enough." Then he turned away, giving her space, as if he already understood that what she needed most was not possession, but patience. That night, alone in her room, Elena pressed her forehead against the window pane and watched the moon rise over the desert. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called, its cry echoing through the valley like a promise and a warning. She didn't yet know which. The night after the wedding felt endless. Rain began to fall soon after the last of the guests departed. Soft at first, then steady. A curtain of sound that swallowed the hush of the great Montrose house. The storm drummed against the roof and rattled the windows, as though the desert itself refused to let the night sleep. Elena sat at her vanity, still dressed in her ivory nightgown, the silk clinging to her skin where tears had fallen. Her reflection trembled in the candlelight, pale face, swollen eyes, and a crown of dark curls that had long since fallen loose. She had not meant to cry. She had promised herself she would be brave. Yet as the hours passed, the weight of what had happened, and what was yet to come, pressed down upon her chest until she could scarcely breathe. She was a bride now, a wife. The word tasted foreign in her mouth. Beyond the closed door, she could hear faint movement from the adjoining room, her husband's room. Chayton had said little since the ceremony ended. He had escorted her home, helped her dismount from the carriage, and nodded politely to the servants before retreating into silence. Not cold, not cruel, simply unreadable. That somehow frightened her more than anger would have. She rose from the chair and crossed the room, bare feet silent on the carpet. The rain's reflection shimmered on the window pane, silver streaks against the darkness. She pressed her palm to the glass as if to feel the pulse of the storm. When the door creaked open behind her, she froze. "Elena," came the low voice. Not commanding, tentative, almost soft. She turned slowly. Chayton stood in the doorway, tall and composed, the firelight catching the sharp lines of his face. He had removed his jacket and boots, his white shirt open at the collar, the turquoise pendant resting against his chest. He looked younger now, less like the man of rumors and more like someone she might have known, had their lives been different. "I did not mean to startle you," he said, stepping closer. His voice held that same calm that both comforted and unnerved her. "I heard you moving. I thought that I was afraid," she whispered before she could stop herself. He hesitated. "Yes." The word hung in the space between them, heavy and honest. Elena's throat tightened. "I am not afraid of you," she said quickly. "Only of what I don't understand." Chayton's gaze softened. "Then we are the same." She blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "The same? I do not know you either," he said simply. "Your world is strange to me. The silks, the tea, the rules. I do not belong in it, yet here we stand, bound by paper and prayer. We have to learn what that means." His words struck her with unexpected relief. She had thought herself alone in her confusion, but now she saw it mirrored in him. Two strangers tied together not by love, but by circumstance, each trying to make sense of the other. He came closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "You need not fear tonight," he said quietly. "I will not touch you until you wish it. That is my word." The breath she had been holding escaped her lips in a small, trembling sigh. Gratitude and shame mingled inside her. Gratitude for his kindness, shame that she had assumed less of him. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why show me such mercy, when you could claim what is yours by right?" "Because," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "you are not something to be claimed." Silence followed. The storm outside had gentled to a whisper, the rain turning to mist against the glass. In that stillness, Elena saw something in Chayton she had not before. Restraint, yes, but also sorrow. As though he too carried wounds that no one saw. "I will sleep in the other room tonight," he continued. "If you need anything, call for me." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Elena's voice stopped him. "Chayton," he paused. "Thank you," she said. Her words were fragile but true. He inclined his head once, a gesture of quiet respect, then closed the door behind him. When he was gone, Elena sank onto the bed and pressed her face into the pillow. This time her tears came not from fear but from something else, something she could not yet name. Perhaps relief. Perhaps the first flicker of trust. Outside, the storm broke completely and the first clear moonlight spilled through the clouds. Elena watched it glide across the room, softening every shadow. Somewhere, deep in her heart, she felt the faint beginning of a change. Not love, not yet, but the fragile peace that comes before it. And for the first time that night, she slept. Morning arrived with a hush that felt almost sacred. The rain had washed the desert clean, leaving the air cool and sharp with the scent of wet sage. Sunlight slipped through Elena's curtains in pale ribbons, touching her face in the corner of the bed where her wedding gown still lay folded. For a brief, drowsy moment, she forgot she was married. Then memory returned. The ceremony, the silence, his promise. She rose slowly, her body heavy with the weight of uncertainty. In the mirror, her eyes looked clearer than they had the night before. There were no more tears. She braided her hair, put on a modest morning dress, and told herself she would meet her husband not as a frightened girl, but as a woman learning to stand in a new life. When she stepped out onto the veranda, the land greeted her in colors she had never noticed before. The red earth shining like copper, the sky wide and endless, the distant mesas veiled in mist. Chayton was already there, sitting on the steps with a cup of coffee in hand. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his eyes, and a tan work shirt clung to his broad shoulders. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady as the land itself. "Good morning," she replied, hesitating at the door. "Did you sleep?" He smiled faintly. "A little." The storm was loud, but it reminded me of home. "This isn't your home?" she asked before thinking. He shook his head, looking out toward the horizon. "Not yet. I built this house for you, but a home is more than walls." Elena joined him on the steps, drawn by something she couldn't name. Up close, he didn't seem as distant as she remembered. The hard edges of his face softened in daylight. There was warmth in his eyes, though they carried the weight of stories untold. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "For my behavior last night, I was frightened." "There is no shame in fear," he replied. "Only in pretending it isn't there." She studied him, curious. "You speak as if you've known fear yourself." "I have," he said simply. "More than once." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. But something in his tone, calm, grounded, yet tinged with memory, told her his past held more than struggle. Perhaps loss. Perhaps exile. She wanted to ask, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, he handed her the second cup of coffee sitting beside him. "You should eat," he said. "Maria cooked for us. She says a new bride must not skip her first meal." Elena accepted the cup, grateful for the small kindness. The warmth seeped into her hands, chasing away the morning chill. "Maria?" she asked. "My aunt," he said. "She raised me after my mother passed. She lives at the ranch near the river. You'll meet her soon." Elena nodded, comforted by the thought of another woman nearby, someone who might understand what it meant to live between two worlds. They sat in quiet for a while, watching the light stretch across the valley. From somewhere far below came the sound of hooves, riders tending cattle or checking fences, she guessed. The rhythm of life here was so different from the refined stillness of her family's estate. Their time had moved like a pendulum. "Here," it breathed. "You don't speak much," she said after a while, smiling faintly. "It makes it hard to know what you're thinking." He chuckled under his breath, a low, warm sound that startled her with its gentleness. "My people believe words should have purpose," he said. "When a man speaks too much, he forgets how to listen." "That sounds very wise," she replied, "though I think I might talk enough for both of us." "Then we will balance each other," he said, and for the first time, his smile reached his eyes. The simple exchange felt like the smallest bridge built between them. No vows, no touch, just quiet companionship. And yet when the wind shifted and carried the scent of sage across the veranda, Elena felt something stir inside her. Not fear this time, but curiosity. She realized she wanted to know him, to understand what lay behind that calm, deliberate silence. As the morning grew brighter, Chayton stood and set down his cup. "I have business at the ranch," he said. "You're welcome to walk the gardens. Maria will send for you at noon." Elena nodded, trying not to show her disappointment that he was leaving. "Will you return before supper?" He hesitated, then said softly, "Yes, I will always return." She watched him ride away, the sun glinting off his silver stirrups, his figure shrinking into the wide, golden landscape. When he was gone, Elena pressed her hand to her heart and whispered into the breeze, "The gentle stranger," and though she didn't yet know it, she had already begun to fall. By the end of the first week, Elena began to understand that life at the Greyhawk estate was unlike anything she had known before. In her father's house, the days had followed the rhythm of servants' bells and social calls. Tea at 4, piano practice at 5, supper by candlelight. Here the day began with sunlight and work. The air was thick with the scent of horses, leather, and dust. Men rode out before dawn, and women tended gardens, cooked, or wove baskets beneath the shade of cottonwoods. It was not a life of leisure, but of rhythm. Honest, patient, steady. At first, Elena felt like a ghost drifting through it all. She wore fine dresses unsuited for the wind and sand, her lace sleeves catching on door frames and her skirts collecting dust. The servants, most of them Apache or Mexican women, greeted her politely but kept their distance, unsure how to treat a young white bride who looked fragile enough to blow away with the next breeze. It was Maria Greyhawk, Chayton's aunt, who broke the silence first. "Come, Nina," Maria said one morning, waving Elena into the kitchen. The older woman was short, strong, her hair streaked with silver and tied back with a strip of faded blue cloth. "If you're going to live here, you must learn the ways of the house. You cannot drink coffee all day and stare out the window like a caged bird." Elena blushed. "I didn't mean to be idle, ma'am. I just don't know what to do." "Then start here." Maria handed her a bowl of flour and a wooden spoon. "You will help me make fry bread. We'll feed the men when they return from the range." And so Elena rolled up her sleeves and began to learn. Her first attempts were clumsy, the dough too sticky, the oil too hot, but Maria laughed and guided her hands. "No one learns without burning something," she said, smiling. "Even your husband once turned a whole pot of beans into charcoal." Elena's eyes widened. "He did?" "Oh yes," Maria said with a chuckle. "He was 12 and thought he knew everything. You'll see, Nina." Chayton looked serious, but his heart is kind. The land has made him quiet, not cold. Those words stayed with Elena all afternoon. When Chayton returned that evening, covered in dust and sunlight, she was waiting on the veranda with a plate of the fry bread she had made. He dismounted and looked surprised. "You cooked?" he asked. "With help," she admitted, "though I can't promise it's edible." He smiled, that rare, unguarded smile that reached his eyes, and took a piece. "Then we'll find out together." He took a bite, then another. "It's good," he said. "You don't have to flatter me, I'm not." He took one more piece. "You'll learn fast. You already have the courage." Elena felt a strange warmth at his words. Not the polite warmth of social niceties, but something deeper, something that made her chest ache. "I'm trying," she said, "but I feel so out of place. Everything is new, and I don't belong anywhere." Chayton leaned against the railing, the evening sun painting his profile in gold. "You will," he said simply. "The land tests everyone. It asked me the same question once. Who are you and why are you here?" "And what did you answer?" I said, "I am a man who will not leave." The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of sage and the faraway cry of a hawk. Elena felt the truth of his words settle deep inside her. He belonged here, not through ownership, but through connection. She, meanwhile, was still a visitor in her own marriage. "Will you teach me?" she asked softly. "To ride, to cook, to mend fences?" He tilted his head, teasing lightly. "To belong," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, not as a man studying a stranger, but as one who saw what lay beneath her surface, courage masked by gentleness, loneliness disguised as pride. "Yes," he said finally, "but only if you walk beside me, not behind." Elena nodded. "Then that's where I'll be." That evening, as the sun sank behind the mesas, they rode together for the first time. She sat awkwardly on the saddle, clutching the reins too tightly, while he guided her horse with calm patience. The desert stretched out before them, vast, alive, and filled with the hum of unseen life. Elena's fear faded with every step, replaced by the thrill of wind in her hair and the sound of his quiet laughter behind her. For the first time since her wedding, she wasn't thinking of what she'd lost. She was beginning to glimpse what she might find. A week later, when the heat of the day had finally broken, Chayton came to Elena's door holding 2 lanterns and a quiet smile. "Come with me," he said. "I want to show you something." Elena hesitated only a moment. The air inside the house was heavy with supper's smoke, and her mind with thoughts she couldn't untangle. "Where are we going?" she asked, accepting one of the lanterns. "You'll see," he said. "Bring your shawl. The desert cools quickly after dark." They rode side by side across the wide plain as the last blush of daylight faded from the horizon. The land seemed to stretch forever, a vast ocean of shadow and light. The horses' hooves thudded softly against the earth, and a hush settled around them, not empty but full, like the quiet between heartbeats. Elena glanced at Chayton. He rode easily, one hand on the reins, the other resting against his thigh, his profile silvered by the rising moon. He didn't speak much, yet his presence filled the night as naturally as the wind or the stars. After a while, he slowed his horse and nodded toward a ridge ahead. "There," he said. "We'll stop." They dismounted and climbed a short slope on foot. When they reached the top, Elena's breath caught in her throat. Before them stretched a valley bathed in moonlight, a shimmering silver plain scattered with wildflowers, and the faint shimmer of distant water. The air smelled of sage and rain-soaked stone. Overhead, the sky spilled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "Oh," she whispered. "It's beautiful." Chayton didn't answer at once. He stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "My people call this place Tseyanane," he said quietly. "The Mother of Stone. We come here to speak to the land, to listen, not to ask." Elena turned toward him, intrigued. "To listen?" He nodded. "The land remembers everything. The wind carries the stories of those who came before. If you stand still long enough, you can almost hear them." She followed his gaze, letting the silence wash over her. The desert pulsed faintly with life, the chirp of crickets, the soft rustle of grass. And beneath it all, she felt a strange hum, as though the ground itself were breathing. "It feels alive," she said softly. "It is," he replied. "It gives us everything. Food, shelter, strength. My mother used to say that if you forget to thank the land, it will take back what it gave." Elena smiled faintly. "Then I suppose I owe it thanks for this view." Chayton looked at her then. Really looked. The moon catching in her hair, her face open and unguarded. "You do?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, neither spoke. The night wrapped around them like a living thing, cool, still, intimate. Elena felt her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since she'd met him. Wonder. "Did you bring me here to teach me that?" she asked finally. He shook his head. "I brought you here so you would know why I stay, so you could see what I see when I wake each day." "And what do you see?" He turned toward the horizon, his face calm, his tone low. "Freedom. The kind no man can buy or sell. Out there, the world is simple. You work, you endure, you love. The rest doesn't matter." The last word lingered in the air, love, and Elena's pulse fluttered. She wanted to ask what love meant to him, but her throat tightened. So she said instead, "It must be lonely sometimes." "Yes," he admitted, "but it's an honest kind of lonely. It doesn't lie to you." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with the reflection of 1,000 stars. "You speak of loneliness as if it's a friend." He met her gaze. "Perhaps it was until you came." The words hung between them, quiet and sincere. Not a declaration, not yet, but something close. Something tender and real. Elena turned away, pretending to study the horizon, but her heart was no longer steady. The wind picked up, tugging at her shawl, and without thinking, Chayton reached out and settled it over her shoulders. His hand brushed her collarbone, light as the touch of moonlight itself. The warmth lingered long after he stepped back. They stood together in silence until the first hint of dawn touched the far hills. When they finally rode home, the world seemed softer, quieter, changed somehow. Elena couldn't name the feeling blooming in her chest, only that it made the night brighter and the path ahead less frightening. And somewhere deep inside, she knew she would never see the desert the same way again. The following week, the evenings turned colder. The winds that swept down from the mountains carried the bite of autumn, and the scent of rain once again threaded the air. Chayton had business at the far end of the ranch near the foothills and asked Elena to ride with him. They left in the late afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the mesas. The ride was long but peaceful, a trail that wound between cottonwoods and rocky slopes where wildflowers still clung to life in patches of gold. Elena rode beside him with growing confidence, her skirts gathered neatly, her posture proud. When they reached the foothills, the sun was gone, and the world was painted in shades of rose and gray. Chayton led the horses to a small clearing beside a stream. There, beneath a cluster of juniper trees, he built a small fire. Elena helped gather wood, her hands stained with bark and dirt. "You've done this before," she said, watching him work. "Since I was a boy," he replied, striking flint against steel. Sparks caught, smoke curled upward, and the flames came alive, painting his face in shifting amber light. They ate simply, bread, beans, and strips of dried venison. The air was cool and still, and the fire cracked softly between them. Elena had never felt so far from her old life, nor so strangely at peace. "Do you come here often?" she asked, breaking the quiet. Chayton nodded slowly. "When I need to remember." "Remember what?" He was quiet for a long time before answering. Who I was before the world told me who I should be. Elena tilted her head, studying him. You mean before you became rich, respected? He gave a faint, almost sad smile. Before I learned to wear another man's face to survive. The wind shifted, and for a moment the fire flickered low. His words hung in the air, heavy, honest, unguarded. You don't have to tell me, she said gently. Not if it hurts. It doesn't hurt to tell, he said, his eyes fixed on the flames. It only hurts to remember how much it changed me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. When I was a child, my mother taught me the stories of our people, how the stars were the campfires of our ancestors, and how the wind carried their songs. But when I was 10, soldiers came to our village. They said we were to move, for our own safety, they claimed. My father refused. Elena held her breath. He was shot, Chayton said quietly, right there in front of my mother. They burned everything we owned. After that, she took me and ran north. We lived by trading, working for ranchers who paid little and trusted less. She died when I was 15. I buried her by a dry riverbed and swore I'd never beg again. His voice didn't break, but Elena could hear the weight in it, the kind that no man's strength could ever fully hide. The fire popped softly, casting light across his face, and for the first time, she saw not the wealthy landowner her father had chosen for her, but the boy who had fought his way out of ashes. She spoke softly, afraid to disturb the fragile space between them. You built all this. The ranch, the land, your name. From nothing. He nodded once. From less than nothing. The world gives you what you take, and it takes back just as much. Elena's throat tightened. I can't imagine surviving what you did. You would have, he said simply. You're stronger than you think. She looked into his eyes, the fire reflecting in their dark depths, and for the first time she didn't see the distance between them. Their worlds had been different, yes, but pain had taught them both the same lesson. Survival was its own kind of faith. She reached out then, almost without realizing it, and laid her hand over his. The gesture was small, but it bridged years of silence. He didn't move, didn't speak, only turned his palm upward so that their fingers fit together. His skin was warm and rough, hers soft and trembling, but the touch felt right, whole. The night grew colder and the fire burned low, but neither of them moved. Words were no longer needed. The desert around them seemed to hush, as if even the wind respected the truth being shared between two souls who had found one another through pain, chance, and quiet grace. When the fire dwindled to embers, Chayton rose and draped his blanket over her shoulders. Sleep, he said softly. I'll keep watch. As she lay beneath the stars, the sound of the crackling fire and the steady rhythm of his breathing nearby lulled her to rest. And for the first time, Elena didn't feel like a stranger in his world. She felt, finally, deeply that she belonged. The storm came suddenly, without warning, as desert storms often do. They had set out at dawn to return from the foothills, their horses steady beneath them, the air cool and still. But by afternoon the sky darkened in a way that made Chayton's shoulders tense. The light dimmed to an eerie bronze, and the wind began to twist through the grass, carrying the scent of dust and rain. We need shelter, he said, glancing toward the mountains. Now. Within minutes the wind grew into a roar. Elena clung to her reins as sand whipped her face, stinging her eyes. The horizon vanished into a blur of grit and thunder. She had never seen a storm like it, fierce, wild, alive. Chayton rode ahead, guiding them toward a small cabin half hidden in a stand of pines. By the time they reached it, the rain had begun to pour, thick as spilled silver. He lifted her down from her horse and ushered her inside. The door slammed behind them with the force of the wind. Inside, the cabin was simple. One room, a hearth, a wooden table, and a bed built from rough-hewn logs. It smelled of pine and smoke. Chayton moved quickly, lighting the fire with flint and kindling from a dry stack in the corner. The flames caught, pushing back the darkness. Elena stood near the door, shivering. Her dress clung to her skin, soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. The storm howled outside, shaking the windows in their frames. Take this, Chayton said, handing her a blanket. His voice was calm, steadying the anchor in the chaos. You're freezing. She wrapped it tightly around herself, but her hands still trembled. He noticed. You're safe here, he said, kneeling to stir the fire. It will pass soon. Elena nodded, though her throat ached with more than cold. Something inside her had broken open. a pressure she'd carried since the night of their wedding, the weight of expectation and unspoken fear. The storm outside only made it worse. It was as if everything she had hidden within herself was demanding to be seen. She sank to the floor beside the fire. The heat stung her chilled skin, and tears she hadn't meant to cry slipped silently down her cheeks. Chayton turned toward her, startled. "Elena." She shook her head. "I'm sorry. It's not the storm, it's everything." Her voice cracked, fragile as glass. "Since the day we married, I've been trying to be brave, to understand who I'm supposed to be here. Your wife, your equal. Someone worthy of this life you built. But I don't know how. I don't know where I fit." Chayton sat back, his expression softening. "You fit because you are here," he said gently. "That's enough." She looked up, her eyes glistening. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," he replied. "You think you must earn belonging. You don't. It is given and it grows." Elena's lip trembled. "But I'm afraid of me," he asked quietly. She hesitated, then whispered, "No, not of you. Of failing you." He reached out, his hand resting just above hers on the floor, close enough for her to feel his warmth but not touching. "Elena, you cannot fail me. This marriage is not a debt to be paid. It is a road we walk together." Her tears fell freely now. "You make it sound so easy to trust." "It isn't easy," he said. "It's a choice you make again and again, even when the storm comes." The firelight danced across his face, steady, golden, and something inside her finally broke, not from pain but from release. She reached for him, her hand trembling, and this time he didn't hesitate. His fingers closed around hers, strong and sure. For a long moment they stayed that way, listening to the storm batter the roof and the wind scream through the trees. Inside the small cabin, their silence felt like a prayer. Two souls meeting not through words, but through the simple act of holding on. When the thunder began to fade, Chayton stood and pulled another blanket from the shelf. "You should rest," he said softly. She nodded, and when she lay down near the hearth, he covered her carefully, as if afraid she might vanish with the morning light. Then he settled beside the fire, watching over her, as she drifted into sleep. Elena's last thought was not of fear, but of safety, deep, unexpected, unshakable. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside something stronger had been born, something that could weather anything. When Elena woke, the storm had gone. The cabin was washed in a pale gold light, and the scent of wet pine drifted through the open window. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The fire had burned down to embers, and the steady crackle had been replaced by birdsong and the low hum of morning. Then she saw him. Chayton sat near the hearth, his back straight, a blanket draped over his shoulders. He hadn't slept. The light caught in his dark hair, in the calm set of his jaw, in the quiet strength of a man at peace with solitude. He looked up when she stirred, and his eyes softened immediately. "You're awake," he said gently. "How do you feel?" Elena pushed herself upright, still wrapped in her blanket. "Tired," she admitted, "but better." He nodded, relief flickering across his face. "You slept deeply. That's good." She noticed his shirt was damp at the shoulders, from the rain he must have endured while tending the horses the night before. A pang of gratitude struck her. "You stayed up all night," she said softly. He shrugged lightly. "Someone had to keep watch. I wish you'd woken me. I could have—" "You needed rest," he interrupted, his tone kind but firm. "The storm was harsh, and fear takes more from us than we think." Elena smiled faintly, lowering her gaze. "I must look a sight. You look," he said, pausing as though searching for the right words, like someone who fought through the night and won. Something warm spread through her chest at that. Not just the compliment, but the simple sincerity behind it. He spoke to her as though she were not fragile, not breakable, but capable. It was a feeling she hadn't known she needed until now. Chayton rose and poured water from a canteen into a small tin cup. He handed it to her. "Drink," he said. "We'll ride back once the trail dries." She took it, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you." "For everything," he nodded once. "You don't owe thanks. I only did what I should." "You always say that," she said, tilting her head. "That you do what you should. But who taught you what's right?" He sat back on his heels, considering her. "My mother," he said after a moment. "She told me that strength without kindness is weakness in disguise. I learned early that the world tests a man's mercy more than his might." Elena smiled gently. She must have been a remarkable woman. She was, he said quietly. You remind me of her sometimes. The words caught her off guard. Me? Yes, he said simply. She had the same eyes, the kind that see the truth even when the world hides it. The cabin fell silent again, but it was not the silence of strangers. It was the kind that lives between two people who have begun to understand one another. The fire hissed softly, and light spilled across the floor like a golden river. Elena turned toward the window. The sky outside was streaked with pink and gold, the desert glistening from the rain. It's beautiful, she whispered. Chayton followed her gaze. It always is after a storm. The words seemed to mean more than weather. She looked back at him, realizing that he wasn't talking about the desert at all. He was talking about them. About what they had endured in silence and what was now quietly mending. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, no longer husband and wife bound by arrangement, but two people meeting again for the first time. Stripped of pretense, then without a word, he reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. His hand lingered for a heartbeat too long, his thumb grazing her temple. The touch was feather-light, reverent, a question, not a claim. Elena didn't move away. Her heart thudded softly in her chest, not from fear this time, but from the realization that she didn't want distance anymore. All the walls she had built, all the doubts she had carried seemed to fall away in that moment. Outside, the first full light of dawn spilled across the land, painting everything in hues of gold and rose. The storm had cleansed the sky, leaving it vast and open. When Chayton finally spoke, his voice was quiet, roughened by emotion. Elena, he said, you have nothing to prove, not to me, not to anyone. She met his gaze and whispered, then let me be myself. He smiled, small, real, and full of something that felt like hope. That's all I've wanted. They sat together in the glow of the rising sun, the fire slowly dying to ash, the world outside still glistening with the last traces of rain. Between them, the silence was no longer uncertain. It was peace. And as the light grew stronger, chasing the last shadows from the room, Elena realized that love didn't always come in thunder and passion. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the steady hand that kept watch through the storm, and the promise that waited until sunrise. When Elena and Chayton rode back to the ranch, the world felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The desert stretched before them in endless waves of color, the air crisp and clean after the storm. Water pooled in the canyons, reflecting the bright blue of the morning sky. Every rock, every cactus, every sound of wind through grass seemed newly alive. The land she had once feared now felt like something she could reach out and touch, a living thing that breathed with her. She glanced at Chayton as they rode. He was quiet as always, but there was something softer in the way he looked at her now. The faintest trace of a smile when their eyes met, as though they shared a secret the world didn't yet know. When they reached the ranch, Maria was waiting on the porch, her apron dusted with flour. She rushed forward the moment she saw them. Gracias a Dios, she cried, clasping Elena's hands. I prayed the storm didn't take you. We found shelter, Chayton said, dismounting. The trail was washed out, but we made it through. Maria's sharp eyes flicked between them, reading the truth in their silence. Her expression softened. You both look different, she said, smiling knowingly. Maybe the storm gave you back what the wedding took. Elena blushed, but she didn't deny it. Over the next few weeks, life at the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Chayton left early each morning to ride the range, and Elena began to take part in the running of the household. She learned to cook with Maria, to mend clothes, to tend to the garden. More than that, she began to listen, to the workers, to the rhythm of the land, to the pulse of a world she had once thought foreign. At first, the ranch hands watched her cautiously. She was the outsider, the soft-handed bride from a world of china teacups and polished floors. But Elena refused to stand apart. When the men rode in dusty and tired, she brought water herself. When a child scraped a knee, she knelt and cleaned the wound. Her laughter began to echo through the courtyard. Light, genuine, infectious. One evening, when Chayton returned from the fields, he found her sitting by the barn with one of the younger stable boys, showing him how to read from a book she'd brought from home. The boy's eyes were wide, tracing each letter as her finger moved along the page. Chayton watched from a distance, unseen. his heart full with something he didn't know how to name. That night, after supper, he found her in the garden, trimming herbs beneath the glow of lantern light. "You've changed this place," he said quietly. She looked up, smiling faintly. "I'm only trying to help." "You've done more than help," he said, stepping closer. "You've given this house a voice. My men speak of you with respect." Maria laughs more. "Even the horses seem calmer." Elena laughed softly, the sound mingling with the chirp of crickets. "You make it sound like magic." "Maybe it is," he said. "You bring peace with you." She looked at him for a long moment, the lantern's light catching in her eyes. "I didn't know I could." "You didn't have to know," he said. "You just had to be." They stood together in the warm night air, surrounded by the scent of sage and rosemary. Elena felt a quiet pride rise in her chest. Not vanity, but fulfillment. For the first time in her life, she wasn't living under her father's shadow or someone else's expectation. She was living herself. "I used to think strength was about doing what was expected," she said softly. "Now I think it's about choosing what's right, even when no one else understands." Chayton nodded slowly. "Then you've learned the hardest truth. And what's that?" "That freedom is earned," he said. "Not given." Elena smiled, the wind lifting her hair. "Then I suppose we're both free now." Chayton reached out, brushing his fingers against her wrist. The touch was light but sure, and meant a promise, not a question. "Yes," he said. "Together." Above them, the stars began to brighten one by one, scattered like embers across the sky. The night air hummed with the quiet pulse of the land, and for the first time Elena didn't feel like a stranger to it. She belonged, not because she had been accepted, but because she had chosen to belong. And when Chayton pulled her gently into his arms beneath the starlight, she didn't tremble this time. She simply closed her eyes, resting her head against his chest, listening to the rhythm of his heartbeat. Steady, strong, and certain. It was the sound of a new beginning. The sound of her awakening. The years passed gently, like the slow turn of the desert seasons. The ranch grew and prospered under their care. New fences lined the fields. New barns rose along the horizon, and the sound of laughter and work filled the air from sunrise to sunset. But more than the land itself, it was they who changed. Chayton and Elena, two souls once divided by silence, now bound by a love both quiet and fierce. Elena no longer felt like the timid girl who had wept on her wedding night. The fear that had once shadowed her had long since faded, replaced by calm strength. She had learned to ride like she was born in the saddle, to feel the rhythm of the land beneath her. Her voice carried weight now. The workers listened when she spoke, and the children ran to her when they fell. Chayton often said she had become the heart of the ranch. "Without you," he told her once, "this place would be strong. But it would never breathe." They built a life together, not on grand gestures, but on the steady rhythm of shared days. Riding the fields at dawn, planning the harvest, mending fences, watching the sky. At night they sat by the fire, speaking in low voices about dreams too sacred to share with the world. Sometimes, when the wind carried the smell of rain from the mountains, Elena would think of that first storm, the one that had nearly broken her and instead bound her to him forever. She could still see the cabin in her mind, the flicker of firelight, the quiet in his eyes, the promise he never spoke aloud. Now, she understood it all. One morning, long after the summer rains, Elena woke before sunrise. The world outside was still dark, the horizon only just beginning to blush with light. She slipped from bed without waking Chayton and walked out to the porch. The air was cool, filled with the scent of sage and dew. In the distance, she could hear the soft murmur of the river and the low, rhythmic sound of horses moving in the corral. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stood there, watching the first light break across the desert. The sky came alive, and pink, then gold, then a deep, fierce blue. The sun climbed slowly, steady and sure, until it set the land ablaze with brilliance. Behind her, the door opened quietly. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. Couldn't sleep? Chayton's voice was warm with sleep, gentle as ever. Elena smiled faintly. The dawn called. He came to stand beside her, his arm slipping easily around her shoulders. "You always did love this hour. It reminds me of beginnings," she said softly, "of how far we've come." He looked out at the horizon, nodding. "And how much we still have ahead." For a long moment they stood in silence, side by side, not as the uncertain bride and the proud rancher they once were, but as equals, partners, lovers. The years had added lines to their faces and a touch of silver to his hair, but the fire between them had never dimmed. If anything, it had only deepened, settling into something unshakable. Elena turned to him, studying the man who had once been a mystery and was now the center of her world. "Do you ever regret the way it began?" she asked quietly. "That it wasn't by choice?" He shook his head, eyes soft with memory. "I don't regret what fate begins," he said. "Only what I failed to cherish. And I've cherished you, Elena, every storm, every sunrise." Her throat tightened. "Then we were lucky." "No," he said with a faint smile. "We were tested, and we passed." The wind stirred the hem of her shawl, and for a moment she thought of the girl she once was, frightened, uncertain, a stranger in her own life. That girl was gone now, replaced by a woman who had learned what it meant to love not because she had to, but because she chose to. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You once said I reminded you of your mother." He smiled, eyes glinting in the light. "I did. What would she think of me now?" "She'd say," he whispered, brushing his thumb against her chin, "that you've become the woman of the dawn, the one who brings light where there was none." Elena's eyes filled, but this time it wasn't with tears of fear or sorrow. It was gratitude. Together, they watched the sun rise higher, painting the world in gold. The horses whinnied softly, the river shimmered, and the desert stretched endless before them, vast, wild, alive. And as the light touched her face, Chayton turned to her, smiling. "It's a good day," he said. "It is," Elena replied. "Every day with you is." The wind moved through the grass, carrying the sound of life across the land they had built together. And for the first time in her life, Elena understood that love didn't need to be loud to last. It could be quiet, steady, like sunrise, forever new.